Okay, so let's just hide this for a second, and you can play along if you like, so you can see how joints work. So whenever you set up a joint system, you almost always want to do it in one of the orthographic views rather than in the perspective view. There's almost no ever any reason to set something up in the perspective view because you need to work in a single plane each time. So I'm just going to go into the side view here and just create some joints. So all the joint stuff is here under skeleton, and we're going to use the create joints tool. Now the tool settings, you typically just want to leave at their default, so I'm just resetting to make sure I'm back to the default here. And I'm going to just make joints without any model yet. I'm going to use the X key to snap to the grid here, so we have something like this. Now these joints are looking too big. I think I have selection highlighting. Turn it off. So this is something that's different in the new Maya. Normally, there's a setting that's different here. Normally when you select the parent joint, it selects all the children too, or it shows them as being selected. They all get selected? Yeah, I think it must be a setting that I have. So if things look a little different, it's just because I've been futzing around too much. So when the joints are kind of fat like that, you can change under display, if you go down to animation and to joint size. This is a global setting, and you can just change them so they're sort of skinnier and longer looking. Doesn't really matter, but depending on what your model is shaped like. So what a joint system is merely a visible representation of a hierarchy. So if I look in the outliner here, joint 1 is the base joint here, so the parent joint, and joint 5 is the greatest grandchild joint. So if I rotate joint 1, all the children follow, right? And we saw that last week when we were doing our simple animation. Now each one of these joints has an orientation, and this becomes important if you're doing a more complex rig. Typically, if we look in here, if we tell it to display, where did I keep that now? Labels. So if I just hit D on the keyboard here, you can see that the joint is pointing down in the X direction. So if I'm doing an arm rig, I do the shoulder, then the elbow, then the wrist. Each joint is going to be pointing in the X direction towards the next joint. It's important because Maya has to figure out how to rotate these joints. And there's a thing that can happen called gimbal lock. Have you guys heard of gimbal lock before? So gimbal lock is what happens when you've got a joint and you rotate it. So if you're rotating about the y-axis, which is up and down, and that means this axis around here, let's say, is the z-axis. When you rotate this 90 degrees, now the z-axis is here. And then if you rotate the y-axis this way, and then the z-axis and x-axis are aligned. And you get this thing called gimbal lock, where Maya doesn't know what to rotate anymore. And it gets confused. And you get weird things with joints. If the orientation is messed up, where you get joint flipping, so for example, you could be animating somebody's arm, and the elbow's pointing this way, and all of a sudden it'll pop and point the other way. So you have to manage the joint orientation. So in this case, it's easy because we just did one after the other, all pointing in the same direction. But if you had to go in and start futzing with the joint, so let's say I wanted to move joint 3 over a little bit. To do that, I can do it in a couple ways. The easiest thing is to go into D mode, which is to move the pivot point. And so this is just a a visible representation of pivots, right? There's no actual object here. So if I move the pivot point, you can see it moves the whole joint over. Okay, so if we look up a little closer now, you can see the x-axis is no longer pointing down the joint. It's pointing up this way. So now we've got a bad rig. The rotation will be unpredictable at this joint now. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do this. If you create a rig and you need to move something over for the elbow joint, you've got to do that. So one thing you have to do when you're creating any kind of rig is just make sure the joints are pointed in the right direction. Now there are hugely complicated ways of doing this for complex rigs, and somebody like Brittany is doing the skeleton. You're going to have to do a little more in-depth investigation into character animation and how to set up these rigs. But the simplest way to solve this problem is if you select the joint system and go to skeleton, there's an orient joint function here. And you can tell Maya to fix this stuff. So the primary axis is x. If I just go down to the reset setting just to make sure. So primary axis means the direction it's pointing when it goes to the next joint. So again, we want this, in this case, to be x. It could be y, it could be z, depending how you first set things up. You just want it to be consistent throughout. And we also want to orient the children of the selected joints, because we selected the grandparent here, and he's already pointing in the right direction. So is his child. Yeah.
Sorry, just a pause. How do you just select one of the joints and not all of the children?
I don't know. It's just doing that for me. If you select the grandparent, all of mine are selected, because if I go to move, all of them move, right? It's just not showing it. It's showing a historical relationship. Whenever you see something that's selected and then other things turn purple, it means they're historically bound to each other somehow. And so there's a construction history between these ones, and it's the parent-child relationship.
So how did you pull that one aside?
I just selected it. If you have D selected, then you grab one. It will move without moving the other ones. Because, like I say, this is just a pivot, and D moves pivots without moving the object, so it wouldn't move it as a whole. But thanks, that's a good question. I'm just going to undo back. And so we do want to orient the children of the selected joint, so let's just get close so we can see what's going to happen here. So this is the one we moved. Change my background color. Let's see a little more clearly. So now when I click apply, you can see this one pops to the right position. Now it's pointing down in the correct direction. So it's going to hopefully rotate more predictably. Okay. So at a very basic level, if you're setting up a rig for something and you make joints and then you've got to adjust them by using the D key, one thing you want to remember is to reorient them after you've done that to make sure all of the x-axes are pointing down towards the next joint. Okay. So let's look at a really simple setup. We'll do a little leg here. So we'll create a new joint, and so you want to move from the root out. So for a leg, the root is going to be at the hip. When you do a whole body, the root's going to be here in the pelvis somewhere. Because you want the lower body to act independently of the upper body. So you can twist, you can move the legs, things like that. So it can be a branching hierarchy. So we'll just start with the leg. So I'm doing from the side view here, so I'll just click. Now, even though my leg right now is straight, you want to rig it so it's slightly bent. You want to have some slight bend in the joint system if it's an object that's only ever going to bend in one direction, like a knee or an elbow. So Maya knows the preferential bending orientation. Okay, so in this case, we're just going to go out 1 unit. So the knee is not just right below. And then we can go back to the ankle, the ball of the foot, and the toe. Okay. Now again, if you're doing full character setup, we're not going to get in this today, but you want to look through the Maya help files about how to name these things properly. The reason for that is you're going to rig one side of the body, and you're going to call this R_wrist, R_elbow, R_shoulder, because there's functions in Maya to tell it just to mirror it to the other side and rename to L, shoulder, L, elbow, L, wrist. Naming is very important in joint systems, and most of the stuff that we do can be a little looser, but they have more well-defined setups for character animations. So if you are doing something with more of a character animation, you want to look into that. So for now, I can just call this hip, not hyop, but hip, knee, ankle, ball, and toe. Now there's also something you want to do when you do a real leg setup called a reverse foot. Because what does a leg do? It helps you walk, right? But it does two different things. If you are doing a walk, you've got your mid-stride where the leg is lifted up and you're pivoting on the left leg. And then when you do a heel strike, when this foot comes down, your pivot is now on your right leg and your left leg is free. So you've got this alternating pivot between left leg, right leg, right leg, where at one point it's swinging like a pendulum, and another point it's becoming the pivot for the whole body. So you've got to create a rig that can allow that pivot to sometimes be on the floor and sometimes be swinging in the air. So we're not going to talk about the reverse foot today because it gets a little beside the point for most people, but it's a very common setup. I think I even have a tutorial on the wiki about how to set it up. So here I've created this thing, and now all my joints are pointed in the right direction I can see, but I might want to click on the reorientation again just to make sure everything's nice and clean. So skeleton, orient joints. With the parent selected, the hip selected, and just click orientation. Nothing changed because everything is already fine. So let's look at one of these joints. So you've got your transform attributes here, then you've got your joint orient here. So you can see that my hip's not pointed straight down, it's pointed in a certain direction. So that's where that information is recorded. And if you're doing a more complex setup, this is the stuff that you have to mess around with to get it nice and clean. Now you can turn on, sorry, I'll move on. Is that better? You can label these joints. You can have the labels turned on so it will say what the joint is. Right now this is called none. But there's a default for hip here. I can turn that on and it will say hip up there. So if you are setting up a complex rig, it's worthwhile adding these labels. You can go and there's another one for other. Yeah, so other here, you can call it whatever you want, and that label will come up. There is an option to limit the amount of rotation on a joint. So let's say you don't ever want the elbow to extend past full extension here. You can put it into that position and you can limit its rotation about the appropriate axis here. So if it's pointing down the x-axis, it's going to be probably, I don't know, Z or Y rotation that you'd want to limit here. So you can do that here just to force it not to flip. Okay. So when you're animating a joint system like this, you can do it in two different ways. We talked about this last week a little bit using two things, either forward kinematics or inverse kinematics. So forward kinematics means just to select a joint, go into rotation mode, and to set keys on the rotation. So here's the Z rotation. You can see rotate Z is going around. And when you have a nice, cleanly oriented joint and it has to just rotate in a single direction, you can see that only one attribute is changing rather than all three rotate orientations. So I can just set a key on rotate Z, change the time, set another key, and then we've got animation. Good. So you guys did this last week when you were doing your baseball throw. But a lot of the time this is not practical to do, especially when you have a moving pivot point. Let's say this person has to squat, right? So if you wanted to make this rig squat, if I do something like set a key on the position of this, for example, if I try and move the position, you'll see that the whole thing moves, right? Because of the way the hierarchy is set up. Now I could try to keyframe these things and lock these into position, and in fact that's what the reverse foot does. But when you need to do something where the pivot point is at the children's level, you want to set an IK for this. So this is inverse kinematics. So we looked at this with the spline last week a little bit. But simple inverse kinematic setup is one that's described here between the hip and the ankle. So if I just go to skeleton and create IK handle, now you probably use a single chain solver. There's also a rotate plane solver. And solver, why is it called a solver? It's called a solver because, well, let me just set one up and then I'll show you. So between the hip and the ankle here. And now there's a new thing in the outliner called an effector at the end of the joint system and an IK handle. And if I grab that IK handle, you can see that now I can move the grandchild, the ankle, and it's forcing the hip and the knee to solve their own rotation. So that's what the solver is. Maya has to figure out how to maintain the relationship without changing the length of these joints and solve how they're going to rotate. And so because I put a little bit of bend in the knee, when I move this up, it bends in the correct direction. If it was straight down, the IK wouldn't know what direction to go in. Okay? Now if you want this guy to do squats, if you now grab the hip and move down, the same thing still happens. But if we do something like keyframe the ankle, so let's say now this isn't really the way you do it with this, you would make a reverse foot, a secondary rig on top of it, but for now we can just set keys on its translate. And now if we grab the hip, hopefully nothing will happen. Let me do a simpler one. So I'm going to put an IK handle in here. So that should move. Oh no, I've got to put a key on the IK handle. So if I set a key there, and then grab the parent, now you can do squats or push-ups. So same thing if I go back to this one, select the IK rather than the joint. Now select the hip, and then you can force it to the IK to stay locked. So for example, Brittany, for yours, you're doing things like the biceps curl, right? So you're going to set up a pretty simple joint system, but it's going to have to branch out and accommodate the fingers and things like that, right? So let's look at a branching system. And so for this type of animation, this would be forward kinematics. So you wouldn't use IK to do that because you want to lock the elbow when you're doing that. And if you use IK, Maya's going to try and do weird stuff and you're going to get this sort of animation. So in that case, you would just do an animation with forward kinematics, rotating the elbow. Now you can have an IK set up and do forward kinematics two. I'm not going to go into this too much, but you can see with the IK selected, let me just delete the keyframes here. There's an IK blend. When it's set to 1, it will follow the IK. If it's set to 0, then you can go back and start to just do typical FK. And you can animate between those two. Rigging, you could spend the whole year, 4 years, just learning rigging alone. Rigging is a very complex thing. And if you work in a big studio, the people, that's all they do is rigging. So let's look at a slightly more complex setup. Any questions so far? Okay. So I'm going to do a bit of this, and then we're going to get into using this to make a scene to composite, and we'll use the Mila materials and stuff like that. So we'll see all the stuff. Yeah.
I have a quick question. In terms of like drawing out the joints and everything versus using the IK skeleton, like the pre-made one, is there an advantage to one or the other?
I've never used the IK skeleton, so I don't know. But if you're doing a human figure, it's probably worthwhile using the IK skeleton. However, with a real skeleton that you're rigging, it may be more complex than that, because that's typically used for a deformable mass. So rigging a body where things have to bend at the elbow, so it's one mesh that has to bend and deform at the joints. Yours isn't going to do that. You're going to have a joint here, a joint here, and then you're going to have the radius and ulna just parented to this joint.
Yeah.
Right?
So it might be better to just draw it from scratch.
So in your case, and because you might want to have one joint for each vertebra, which the IK won't have, then you'll probably want to do that from scratch. Yeah. I can show you the type of stuff. Let me just show you a project I worked on recently. If I can find it. Dropbox. Oh boy. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I've been working on this fossil rig for a while, or I was last year. I'm just kind of on hiatus right now. But so here's a slightly more complex setup. So I've got all of this geometry, and they're separate bones, so they don't have to deform, right? They just have to move. But there's a rig in here too. I must have it hidden. Show joints, show IK handles. So even though this is more complex, you can see I've got that hip to ankle IK here that's doing the same thing. And then I've got IKs and joints going through here. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see for each of the phalanges here, there's one joint. But stretching out over all of them, there's this one longer joint. Because this is a weird setup. Now, this took me forever to figure out. But this is a claw that has to act like a foot. So when we do human feet, you don't have to rig the toes to be able to grab stuff, typically, right? But in this case, it's got to act like a pivot, move, and then do the toe off, the ball roll, and then the toe off, and then be able to go like this and grab things. It doesn't actually grab anything, but it could grab something if it wanted to. So it had to be a much more complex setup. But you can also see here that it's a split hierarchy here. So we get to the wrist, and then we've got this is the hind limb, so the tarsals here all set up. So I've got a central one for the astragalus, going to the distal tarsals, and then the metatarsals, and then the phalanges here. I think this one is animated. Yeah. Oh, animated poorly. There's something weird going on here. But you can see how there's some flop to the toes there. Let me just turn off the joints. and the IKs. So a bit of weird sliding at the end there. It's one of the hard things to get a joint system to stay static when there's so much going on. This is like a pre-proto dinosaur. It's like shaped like a monitor lizard, so it's got this weird sort of, it throws its leg and then walks and throws its leg in this weird floppy kind of fashion. So we're trying to model it to see what the limitations are of the joint systems here. So this is a case where you don't need the joints to deform the objects at all. So each of these objects is just parented to a joint. So, for example, my left leg pose, joint 1, has phalanx 1 proximal, just parented to it. So I just middle mouse dragged it on top. So I'm not skinning it, just parented. And that's what you'll be doing too. So what we're doing, oh yeah, so let's just open a new file again. Let me set the project to the right spot. Okay. So let's say you had to do something like a hand rig here. So I'll do from the elbow or the shoulder out. So I'm just going to create joints. So start with, say, shoulder. And this is, I'm imagining, is from above. I'm doing the front view, but looking down, if I'm modeling like this, I'd probably want to model so the radius and ulna are side by side. So, anatomical positions like this, and they're not folded over each other. Yeah, so we want the hands to be out like this. So from the front view, you could do the elbow down a little bit, the wrist bent a little bit, or from the top view, you could do it this way so the elbow's out a little bit. Anyway, I'll just do like from the front. I don't know. Here. So that's elbow, wrist. And then, so we want to have wrist going out. It's not going to deform. So then we're going to go out to different points here. Now this isn't going to be a great hand rig or anything. So thumb 1, thumb 2, thumb 3. So now I want to do the other 4 digits. The easiest way to do it is to get out of this tool by hitting Y. That will finish it and launch it again. And then I can just draw the other joints. So if I hold down X, I'm going to stop holding down X now. So that's the rotating point of the proximal phalange, or phalanx, sorry. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to do another one. 1, 2, 3, 4. That one shouldn't be so short. We'll hit Y to launch it again. I'm being sloppy here. So it's complete, and now we've got a hand set up, sort of, that is not connected yet. So if we go to, so joint 1 is the shoulder. And then elbow, wrist, and then we've got thumb 1, thumb 2, thumb end. But now we've got these other ones. I'm not going to name all these right now, but I'll just do this one. This is the index finger, let's say. So this could be, how does it go? Is this number 1 or number 5? What's the thumb? Test.
I think 1.
This is pinky is 5. Okay, so we'll call this one number 2. So we'll call this P2 proximal, and then whatever, P2 medial, or middle, P2 distal, P2 end. So, but it's separated right now. So the way you join separated joint systems is through an active parenting. So you can do it all here in the outliner. So we want to join these to the wrist. So we need to make a connection. So if I just grab P2 proximal and middle mouse drag it onto wrist, you can see a new joint is created, or a bone is created between them. And if I do that for all of these, just middle mouse drag them to wrist, it will create the joint system in the way that I want it. So now if I take shoulder, everything moves. So here we still have to reorient our joints because things are a little bit messy right now. And you'll see if we go in close here, the one that we can never fix is this wrist one because it doesn't know who to point at because it's got 5 children, right? So it has to average its X orientation between all of them. So if you need some fancy rotation here, you don't want to have a branching thing coming out of something you need complex rotation from. So if that's the case, you'd want to maybe insert a second joint in between and have one in the middle of the palm where everything else branches from. It gets a little tricky with the thumb because the thumb has a weird rotation with the saddle-shaped joint and stuff. It's a little trickier, but anyway. So I'm still going to select the shoulder and do a skeleton orient joint and set that. Nothing should really happen because everything is pointing in the as well as it can. Just the wrist is messed up, and you see these end ones are pointed not at anything because they have nothing to point to. But we never use these end joints to rig to. These are just the ends of our joint system. So they should never be considered in your rig. So here we could put an IK between the shoulder and the wrist to get, oops. So we can animate it like this. Hey, how's it going? And for the fingers, we want to do something else. And this is going to introduce a new animation concept you guys probably haven't done before called set-driven keys. You guys done set-driven keys? Okay. So what a set-driven key is, and this can be used with anything. It's not just with joint systems, but it's often used with joint systems. It's a way to create new attributes for you to control the movement of something in a predictable way. So, for example, let's say we have the fingers and we want to animate them curling like this. We could go through and animate each one of these joints all the time, every time that happens, but that's nonsense, right? So for you, you've got to do the fingers curling around the barbell or something. Other thing you might want to have is, so you flexion, extension, you got abduction, adduction, other things. You might want to have pinky curl, ring curl, middle curl. You might want to separate all these things out. So what we're going to do is create some new attributes for our rig to simplify that. So you have to imagine there's rigging you and then there's animating you. And rigging you wants to keep animating you happy. Okay? So we're going to do that. We're going to keep animating you happy. So when you do a rig like this, another thing you might want to do is make things easily selectable. So for example, there's going to be a lot of animation grabbing that IK handle and moving it around, right? And it's easy to usually select an IK handle because it's got priority selection up here. It's one of these things. It's selected with priority over joints. So if you just do a marquee selection around here, you're going to get the IK handle, which is great. However, you also have to think animating you is an idiot, because you are. Not you, but animating you. Right now, you're rigging you, and you're going to break your rig because animating you is a dummy. So we're going to make things as easy as possible for animating you. So one way you can do that is to create control objects. So you can do it with cubes or with curves. So I'm just going to create a circle, like a NURB circle. Scale this up. So let's just go to this view here. Maybe select these and give it a distinctive shape. So something like that. And we want, when animating you is going to move this hand, we want animating you to grab this thing and nothing else. So we're going to move this over and pop it onto this joint. We'll pop it onto this joint by using V and middle mouse to do a vertex snap. And we'll rotate it and maybe make it big because animating you is a moron. There, that's what you have to select. And we want to use this to move things around. So we're going to constrain that IK handle to this joint. Okay, it doesn't have to be that big. And we'll call this wrist control, something like that. So we can do this in a couple of ways. We could make the wrist a child of wrist control, but if we do that by middle mouse dragging this down, you can see it breaks our rig, because a rig is just a representation of child-parent relationship. So instead, we have to use a constraint. I'm going to change the name of this to wrist IK. So we'll use a constraint. So constraint, we'll use a parent constraint. So a parent constraint has both rotation and translation built into it. So we want to select the controller first, and then the thing to be constrained second. That's the wrist IK. And we're going to use a parent constraint for this. I'll just open up the options. Now, one thing you want to make sure is that you turn on maintain offset right now. Because right now, and I'm being sloppy actually, before I do this, I'm going to delete the history on this, freeze the transformations of this controller. Because right now, the wrist controller is rotated in a certain way, and the wrist IK is also rotated in a certain way. And if you don't turn on maintain offset, that wrist IK will suddenly pop to match the rotation of the controller. Maintain offset just says, keep the relationships as they are from the beginning and then follow in the future. Okay, so yes, got that selected, yep, good. Apply. So now when I grab this controller, things will move. And ultimately you can turn off IK view, so you don't even have to see them. You can turn off joint view and things like that, if the animator doesn't actually have to interact with those things. Okay, and so if you need to move the hand, you can set keyframes on this thing instead. So the parent constraint, I heard that, is under animation. Yeah, so it's under the animation menu set, or in the hotbox just down here in the lower right quadrant.
Where's the not row? Keep main row.
So if you go to constrain parent and open the option box, then the maintain offset, you want to make sure that's turned on. Again, I'm simplifying sort of a vastly complex procedure for rigging something, but I just wanted to introduce some of the basic ideas. So if you have to go further with it, you'll have a good starting point. So the other thing that this is useful for, okay, what time is it? Let me just finish this part, take a short break. The other thing this is useful for is for housing control options that you can create. So this wrist control thing, we can put controls on it to curl the fingers, for example. So let's do that. So I'll select the risk control curve, and in the attribute editor, and you probably want to do it in the transform node rather than the shape node, because that should be selected when you grab this thing. You can see down here there's the possibility of having extra attributes, and it's empty right now. But we can create some attributes here. So up here at the top of the attribute editor, which you open with Control A, go to Add Attributes, and a new window will open up, and we'll call this one, let's just call this one Index Curl. Okay. We want it to be keyable, because we want to be able to animate this. It's going to be a float. So a float is just not an integer, but just it's a decimal number, right? It's not a vector because it's not a 3-value number. It's not an integer because it's got to go between whole numbers, and so on. So we just want to keep it as a float, scalar. So let's say the minimum curl we want is 0. The maximum curl we want is 1. Okay. Oops, I erased all my things. Stupid. Index curl float 0 1. Okay. So now you can see in extra attributes there's a nice slider with a value in it. You can type in, it shows up in the channel box too, index curl. So we've created a new attribute. It doesn't do anything yet, right? So we've got to hook it up to the index finger. So here's my index finger, and what do I want curl to look like? I want curl to look like, well, if I select each joint, so select the children first, then shift select its parent, shift select its parent. Now if I go into rotation, it will rotate them all separately, or one at a time, so I can get a curl that way. If I just select the parent, it will just rotate from there. So when index curl is at 0, we want it to be in this state, just straight out like that, right? So let's get that page back in the attribute editor. I'm going to click on Copy Tab here, and we'll just copy this risk control part of the attribute editor out, so it doesn't disappear when I deselect it. So if I open up extra attributes, that thing is still there. So you know when you set keys, if you right-click on something, you can set a key. You might notice right beneath it something called Set Driven Key. And that opens up this other thing. And so what is Set Driven Key is it connects the action of one thing to control the action of another. So you've got a driver and a driven. So in this case, the driver is the new attribute we just created. It was loaded into the driven. We want it to be in the driver, so we can just say load driver with that selected. And we want the index finger joints to be the driven. So select one of those and load driven. Capiche? We're good? Yeah. So what am I rotating in here? So this is rotating in Y, I think. Yeah, so that's rotate Y. So that's the attribute we want to drive. So P2P, rotate Y, is going to be driven, and it's going to be driven by index curl. And now I just key it. Boink. Do the next one, up in the joint chain. I have to load driven again, so it loads the right one. Rotate Y, boink. Next one, load driven, rotate Y, boink. So now, what have we done? What have we done? We've said that when index curl is set to 0, rotate Y of all those joints should be set to 0. Easy. So now let's go to the next state. We want to go to 1 in index curl. And then we'll rotate these into the position we want to be represented at that extreme. Yoink. So something like that. Now we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to select the the parent there, so the proximal phalanx. I'm going to load driven, rotate Y, and I've moved wrist curl to 1 already. I'm going to key it, I'm going to grab the next one, load driven, rotate Y, key, grab the next one, load driven, rotate Y, key. So now, if all is good, this controller will rotate. It's a little jumpy for some reason. And so what you're doing is thinking about how dumb Animate You is, and you're just setting up the controllers that he or she needs. Mostly she, I guess. She or he needs to do this. So if you needed to curl all the fingers separately, you would create a curl attribute for each finger. If you needed to hyperextend them, you might make a negative value in curl and keyframe it backwards a little bit, or have another attribute for that. Yeah?
So the object doesn't really matter what it is. It's more for us to select. It has nothing to do with the actual, like it's not going to constrain the joint, if that makes any sense. Like the shape of the object, like it could have been like a square if we had made it. Right?
Oh, do you mean the curve that I just created?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's just a null object ultimately, but one
Yeah.
that's visible in your scene and selectable.
Yeah.
So another one that I often use for this, because, like for example, in that Varanopid rig, that little lizardy thing, I had one around the wrist, and then I had a cube, I think, around somewhere else. So let's say we wanted to use a cube. You probably wouldn't do this, but at the shoulder. So if I create a polygon cube, now I don't want this thing to render. It's just going to be a control object, so I'm going to snap it over here. So Control or V, middle mouse snap. So I can open up the attributes for this thing. I'll call it shoulder control, and then I would change some of its render stats. So in its shape node, I would make it not visible. And then you can also, not in render stats, but in object display, for any object, you can go down to drawing overrides and say enable overrides and just turn off shading. So you just get this wireframe box. It won't render now because I turned off its primary visibility. And we can use this as a controller too. It's easily selectable. So ultimately when you have a joint system set up properly, you don't want Animate You to select any of the joints. So you want to turn off joint selection. You just want Animate You to grab curves, boxes, whatever, at the important areas of control. So, for example, if you really wanted to make things as fail-proof as possible, let's say the only thing I want the animator to be able to do is to move this thing around. I don't want them to be able to scale it, for example. So I could select all the scale. So this is the wrist controller I have selected here. I can go into scale, select into the attribute. Start again. Into the channel box, select the attributes I don't want anybody to mess with, and right-click on them and just say lock and hide selected. And you can just get rid of everything you don't want to be changed by accident. So let me just save this as, and I'll just show you the rig I have for the Varanopid again. I think I've got stuff like this set up for it, I must. So this was a very complicated rig for me. Maybe it's easy for other people, but it took me a long time to figure out how to do it. I had to use some dynamic simulation with follicles and stuff to join together, or not dynamic simulation, but I had to use follicles to join parts of the wrist together so it could move in the way that I wanted. But if I turn on NURBS curves, yeah, so for example, oops. So you can see that I've got, when I want to move the leg, I don't want to have to grab the IK handle. I just want to grab this controller that will allow me to move and also to rotate. Okay. So I know that that's where all my keyframes are going to be. It's all in here. And so you can see I've got phalanx 5 curl, 4 curl, 3 curl. I've got distal fibula slider. So in this case, the fibula is here. And when there's weird rotation, I had to make the fibula slide up and down the joint. So I had to create a new controller for that. And the tibia had to do the same thing. The femur, I wanted to control its rotation separately. Same for the proximal tibia, and so on. But they're all in the same spot. Because I did this, I don't know, 4 months ago or something like that, and I don't remember even setting this up anymore. But if you're consistent with the way you do it, I can go in here now and say, okay, right, it all makes sense. I've got these different things, so I've got roll post, which must do something. Doesn't do anything, never mind. Let's find one that works. Yeah, so curl 4, so I can say I can curl digit 4 there. I think I must have set these up for the roll off, but I didn't set it up that way ultimately. So if I want to set keys on these things, I can select all of these, middle mouse drag, and I can animate these together. Now this is, for any of you who have to do kind of character animation, I'm not going to talk about this, but this is called a pole vector. So when you're doing a walk cycle, the knee doesn't just stay in the same plane. There's some rotation at the hip here, and so the knee will rotate in and out. But sometimes Maya gets really messed up, and you'll go like this, and then the knee will flip over. So there's a constraint called a pole vector, where you put an object that floats in front of the knee and moves with it, but it's a reminder to Maya which way is out. So this pole vector allows me to, if I move it around, I can move the knee around, but it also helps Maya, when it's doing the IK rotation, to remember which direction it should prioritize the knee to be pointing. So that's a pole vector constraint. So if you come across that, that's what that means. So what I'd like to do, we're going to stop, take a break, but after we take a break, we're going to look at doing the IK spline handle for something like DNA, again, something long, and set up a joint system for that, and maybe a dynamic joint system. We'll render out some stuff, put some materials on it, and bring it into After Effects and build a simple shot. So we'll go through those stages again. And then the afternoon, hopefully most of it will be dedicated for you to work on your shot, and I can help out with things. Any questions? No? Okay, so it's, what time is it now? I'm going to stop the recording. It's 11:23. Let's just take a break for 10 minutes. I'm going to go grab coffee, so it might be a little longer. And then we'll get started again, and we'll go to about 12:30 or so, something like that.